Well, I'm sorry I didn't get to see them tonight, but I thought it was a little late for them to be out. It was kind of a surprise when they were here. They should have been...
Somewhere in the United States, there is a storage facility. Nothing special about it from the outside, just rows of climate-controlled units, fluorescent lighting, the kind of place where people put the things they can't bring themselves to throw away, but don't quite know what to do with. And inside one of those units, inside a cardboard box that had been sitting untouched long enough to gather the particular kind of dust that only comes with decades, there was a reel, a tape, a container holding something that the most powerful people in American entertainment had decided the world should never see. It wasn't labeled with anything dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It just sat there, the way forgotten things do, waiting. That's the thing about buried truth. It doesn't disappear. It waits. Now, before we get into what was on that tape, and we are going to get into it, in more detail than you've probably ever heard, you need to understand something first. Because the easy version of this story is that someone lost a tape, someone found it, and now we get to watch it. But that's not what happened here. What happened here is something that has been building since before most of us were born. And it starts not with a discovery, but with a decision. A very deliberate, very calculated decision made by people with enormous power and very specific reasons for making it. Elvis Presley generated more filmed material than almost any entertainer of his era. That's not a surprise. He was the most photographed, most documented, most obsessively recorded artist in American popular music. Cameras followed him everywhere. Film crews shot his rehearsals, personal cameras were rolling in rooms where most people assumed nothing was being captured. The Memphis Mafia, the tight circle of men who lived with him, traveled with him, and essentially orbited his entire existence, many of them were rolling cameras almost constantly. Home movies, backstage footage, private moments that nobody outside that circle was ever supposed to witness. And then, systematically, that footage started disappearing. Not all at once, not in some dramatic bonfire moment. It happened quietly, the way institutional suppression always happens. Through contracts, through ownership clauses, through quiet conversations in lawyers' offices where someone decided that a particular reel wasn't commercially viable, or wasn't on brand, or showed something that the machine around Elvis Presley simply could not afford to have the public see. Some of it was seized. Some of it was purchased and locked away. Some of it was handed over willingly by people who didn't fully understand what they were giving up. And some of it was just buried, put in boxes, moved from place to place until enough time passed and enough people forgot that it ever existed. This was not an accident. That is the single most important thing to understand going into this story. The disappearance of this footage was not negligence. It was not the random entropy of time doing what time does to physical objects. It was a policy, a deliberate, enforced, carefully maintained policy built around a very simple idea that Elvis Presley was too valuable as a product to be allowed to exist freely as a person. And any footage that showed the person, the real, unguarded, unmanaged, unpolished person, was a threat to the product. The first documented instance of footage being pulled happened earlier than most people realize. We're not talking about the twilight years, the period that his estate has historically been most protective of. We're talking about footage from the middle of his career, a period when Elvis was at the absolute height of his cultural power and simultaneously at one of the lowest points of his personal autonomy. The footage captured something that contradicted the approved narrative so directly, so uncomfortably, that the decision to remove it was made within days of it being shot. The official reason given at the time was technical, poor quality, unusable for commercial purposes. The people who were in the room when it was recorded knew that was a lie. Several of them said so years later in interviews that themselves received almost no mainstream attention. That pattern, footage shot, footage pulled, official explanation offered, real explanation buried, repeated itself more times than most Elvis biographers have been willing to fully document. Until recently. Because here's what changes everything. The storage unit. The box. The reel that was never supposed to survive the decades. It did survive. And it wasn't alone. What researchers and archivists have been quietly piecing together over the last several years is not one hidden tape. It's a collection. A body of footage spread across private collections, estate archives, the personal holdings of former Memphis Mafia members and their families, and in some cases institutions that acquired this material without fully understanding what they had. And now, piece by piece, frame by frame, it's coming back into the light. Because here's what nobody tells you about hidden footage. It doesn't get hidden because it's boring. It doesn't get locked away because it doesn't matter. Things get buried because they show you something true. And the truth about Elvis Presley, the real truth, not the approved version, was something a lot of very powerful people spent a very long time making sure you never got to see. So let's talk about what they were hiding. And more importantly, let's talk about why. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when someone sees this footage for the first time. Not the silence of boredom, not the silence of confusion, the silence of recalibration, of a mind quietly dismantling something it thought it understood and rebuilding it around something it didn't expect. Researchers who have spent years working in this space describe it the same way, almost without variation. You go in thinking you know Elvis Presley. You come out knowing you never did. So let's go through it. Not as a list, not as a highlight reel, but the way it actually unfolds when you sit with it, slowly, in sequence, letting each layer settle before the next one arrives. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. The first thing that strikes everyone, without exception, is the voice. And before you think you already know what that means, stop. Because what's captured in this footage is not the voice you've heard on the records. It's not the voice from the concert films or the television specials or the carefully produced studio sessions where every raw edge was smoothed down to commercial perfection. What this footage captures is Elvis Presley singing with nobody listening. Or rather, singing without knowing that the moment was being preserved. And the difference between those two things is everything. When Elvis sang for an audience, even an audience of one, even a producer in a control booth, there was always a layer of awareness, of performance consciousness that shaped the output. Here, in these unguarded moments, that layer is completely absent. And what's underneath it is something that trained vocal coaches and musicologists who have been presented with this material, without being told whose voice they were hearing, have described in terms that border on disbelief. The control, the instinctive melodic intelligence, the emotional specificity of his phrasing in moments when he had absolutely no reason to be specific about anything. It doesn't sound like a greater version of the Elvis you know. It sounds like the source of him, like the place the music actually came from before anyone got their hands on it. Then come the conversations. And this is where the footage moves from remarkable into something genuinely difficult to process. Because what's captured here isn't Elvis talking about his music or his career in the way he did in sanctioned interviews, where every answer had been pre-navigated and every potential landmine had been carefully mapped in advance. These are real conversations. Conversations where Elvis is thinking out loud, following a thread of thought wherever it takes him, saying things that arrived in the moment and were never meant to be recorded. He talks about Colonel Tom Parker in terms that make the official narrative of their relationship, the loyal manager, the grateful star, completely impossible to sustain. He talks about specific albums, specific sessions, specific creative decisions that were made over his objection and released over his name, with a clarity and a controlled frustration that tells you everything about the gap between the art he wanted to make and the product he was contractually obligated to deliver. And then, in moments that are somehow even harder to sit with, he talks about simpler things, about what he misses, about what he wishes his life looked like, about the specific texture of a kind of piece he can describe in detail but has almost no experience of actually feeling. Those moments are not dramatic. They don't arrive with any musical swell or cinematic weight. They're just a man, sitting in a room, telling the truth. And that, somehow, is the most devastating thing in any of it. The performance footage, and there is performance footage, raw and unedited and shot without the infrastructure of a proper production, operates on a completely different level again. There is one sequence in particular that people who have seen it return to again and again, not because it's the most technically impressive thing Elvis ever committed to film, but because of what it reveals about his relationship to the music when nobody was grading it. He is working through a song that most Elvis fans would recognize immediately, and he is taking it apart and rebuilding it in real time, trying different approaches, discarding them, finding something deeper, losing it, finding it again. And in the middle of this process, there is a moment, a single, unrepeatable moment where everything aligns. The voice, the feeling, the specific emotional truth of what the song is actually about. And the people in the room go completely still. You can feel it even through the degraded quality of the recording. You can feel the air in the room change. And Elvis, seemingly unaware that anything extraordinary has just happened, keeps going. As if moments like that were simply the cost of doing business. As if that level of raw, unmanufactured genius was just what it felt like to be him on an ordinary afternoon. And then there's the late footage. The footage from the final stretch. And we're going to spend real time on this, because it deserves more than the narrative it has historically been given. The narrative of decline, of excess, of a man coming apart at the seams. Because what this footage actually shows is not a man falling. It's a man who is exhausted in a way that goes so far beyond the physical that the physical is almost beside the point. It's a man who knows things. About his situation, about the people around him, about what is coming. And who is saying those things, clearly and without self-pity, to anyone in the room who is paying close enough attention to hear? Most of them weren't, and that might be the hardest truth this footage contains. Now we follow the decisions. Because everything we've just walked through, the raw vocals, the unguarded conversations, the performance that stopped a room cold, the exhausted clarity of those final months, none of it disappeared by accident. Someone looked at all of it and made a choice. And understanding that choice, understanding the logic behind it and the people who enforced it, is the only way to fully grasp what was actually taken from you. Start with Colonel Tom Parker. Because you cannot tell this story honestly without starting there. Parker's relationship with Elvis has been documented, analyzed, and debated for decades. But the specific dimension of it that matters here is one that doesn't get nearly enough attention: his pathological need to control the frame. Not just Elvis's schedule, not just his contracts, not just his creative output, but the actual perceptual frame through which the world was allowed to experience Elvis Presley. Parker understood, with the cold precision of someone who had spent his entire life in the business of human spectacle, that the most valuable thing Elvis possessed wasn't his voice. It wasn't his face, or his instinct, or his extraordinary, almost supernatural ability to make a room feel something. Here is something the Elvis documentaries don't linger on long enough. Here is something that gets buried under the candlelight vigils and the anniversary concerts and the beautiful, aching mythology of the man himself. In the months following Elvis Presley's death, while the world was still processing its loss, while radio stations were still playing Suspicious Minds on a loop, and fans were still making pilgrimages to Graceland with flowers they pressed against the iron gates, Colonel Tom Parker was negotiating. Quietly, persistently, and with the kind of confidence that only comes from a man who knows exactly how much the other person needs him. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now, let's continue. The deal that emerged from those negotiations was not published in any press release. It was not announced at a shareholder meeting or celebrated with a handshake photograph. It lived in paperwork. Dense, deliberately complicated paperwork of the kind that is specifically designed to be understood by as few people as possible. And at its core, it was breathtakingly simple in the worst possible way. Colonel Tom Parker would continue to receive a percentage of the merchandising and licensing revenue generated by Elvis Presley's name, image, and likeness. Even in death. Even with no tours to book, no recording sessions to manage, no living artist to handle. Parker had essentially negotiated himself a royalty on a ghost. And the percentage he secured was not modest. Colonel Tom Parker was Elvis's manager for over 2 decades, the architect of his career, the man who controlled nearly every professional decision Elvis ever made, and who took an almost incomprehensible 50% of everything Elvis earned. Their relationship was complicated in ways that biographers have spent entire careers trying to untangle. Parker was domineering, financially suffocating, and by most accounts, one of the primary reasons Elvis felt so trapped in the final years of his life. He needed Elvis to be a product, and products don't get to just walk away. When Elvis died, the people around Parker expected devastation. They expected a man who had just lost his primary source of income and his life's central project to be undone by it. What they got instead was something that struck almost everyone who witnessed it as profoundly strange. Parker was calm, focused. Almost immediately, he was on the phone with IRCA, with licensing partners, with merchandising contacts. Within hours of Elvis's death being announced, Colonel Tom Parker was already restructuring the business of Elvis Presley's legacy with the kind of efficiency that doesn't come from shock. It comes from preparation. Then there's the autopsy. And this is where the official story starts asking more questions than it answers. The autopsy on Elvis Presley was conducted with a speed that medical examiners themselves have since described as unusual for a case of that complexity and public significance. The initial findings were murky. The cause of death disputed almost immediately between cardiac arrhythmia and the staggering number of prescription drugs found in his system. But rather than allowing that dispute to unfold transparently, the full autopsy report was sealed. Not summarized. Not partially released. Sealed. Under Tennessee law, it was locked away from public access for decades, and the complete toxicology findings remained outside of public reach long after most people had stopped demanding them. Why do you seal the autopsy of a celebrity? What is in those findings that required that level of institutional protection? The official answer has always been privacy, protecting the family from additional pain. But families of public figures don't typically get to seal autopsy records in cases where the cause of death is already publicly contested. Someone with significant influence made that happen. And the question of who benefited most from the public never fully knowing what was in that report is not a comfortable one to sit with. It was not the standard industry rate for a posthumous licensing arrangement. It was, by multiple accounts, somewhere in the range of 50%. The same cut he had taken from Elvis while Elvis was alive, working himself into the ground, performing through illness and exhaustion, and a pharmaceutical fog that should have sent everyone around him running for help instead of running for contracts. 50% of a dead man's name. Let that sit for a moment. Now, the natural question, the question that demands an answer, is how? How did this happen? How? The most valuable thing Elvis possessed was the idea of Elvis. The myth, the untouchable, undeniable, larger-than-life construct that had been built around the actual human being like a gilded cage. And anything, any piece of footage, any recorded conversation, any unscripted moment that showed the human being instead of the construct was, in Parker's calculus, a direct threat to the asset. So it disappeared. Quietly, legally, completely. What makes this particularly suffocating when you trace it through the documented record is that Parker's suppression wasn't limited to obviously damaging material. He wasn't just pulling footage that showed Elvis in crisis or conflict. He was pulling footage that showed Elvis being brilliant, in ways that contradicted the commercial direction Parker had chosen for him. Rehearsal footage that revealed a musical intelligence that didn't fit the Vegas showman narrative. Conversation recordings that showed an intellectual depth that complicated the simple, accessible, non-threatening image Parker had spent years carefully constructing. Even moments of genuine joy, unperformed, unmanaged, real, got locked away because joy, real joy, implies a full human interior. And a full human interior is harder to package than a myth. Then there is the estate. And this requires a careful, honest conversation, because the people who have managed Elvis's legacy since 1977 have done genuine work, preserving recordings, authorizing documentaries, maintaining an archive that might otherwise have scattered completely in the decades after his death. That work is real and it matters. But preservation and access are not the same thing. And the criteria by which the estate has historically determined what gets released, what gets licensed, and what stays in the vault have never been fully transparent. What we can say, based on the documented record of what has and hasn't been made available over nearly 5 decades, is that the footage most likely to complicate the approved narrative. The footage that shows Elvis pushing back, breaking down, speaking plainly about the conditions of his own life, has consistently been the footage least likely to surface through official channels. Whether that reflects a deliberate policy or simply the natural institutional conservatism of an organization protecting a billion-dollar brand is a question that deserves a far more direct answer than it has ever received. The machine that controlled Elvis, how a legal and commercial empire buried the truth, and beneath all of this sits the legal and commercial architecture that made indefinite suppression not just possible, but structurally inevitable. Copyright law, estate control, and the licensing infrastructure built around Elvis's image created a system where the people with the strongest financial interest in controlling the narrative also had the most complete legal authority to do so. It is a system that was not designed with Elvis's historical legacy in mind. It was not designed to honor the complexity of a human being who lived a complicated, extraordinary, and often painful life. It was not designed to serve history or truth or the hundreds of millions of people around the world who loved Elvis Presley and believed they deserved an honest account of who he actually was. It was designed with revenue in mind. And those two things, it turns out, have very different relationships with the truth. To understand what that means in practice, you have to understand how completely interlocking these systems were. Copyright law gave the estate control over recorded material. Licensing agreements gave them leverage over anyone who wanted to use that material commercially. And the cultural infrastructure surrounding Elvis, the museums, the tribute industries, the officially sanctioned documentaries, the carefully curated exhibitions, all of it depended on maintaining a cooperative relationship with the people holding the keys. You want access? You play by the rules. You want to tell a different story? You do it without the footage, without the recordings, without the archive. And without the archive, you are telling an incomplete story that can be dismissed, undercut, or simply drowned out by the volume of officially approved content moving in the opposite direction. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. There was no single meeting where powerful men in dark rooms decided to suppress the truth about Elvis Presley. What there was instead was something more mundane, and in many ways more troubling. A system of aligned incentives that produce suppression as a natural output. When the people making decisions about what gets released are the same people whose financial interests are served by controlling the narrative, you don't need a conspiracy. You just need a system. And the system, left to run without meaningful external accountability, will reliably choose revenue over reality every single time. But here is the part that cuts deepest. Here is the part that stays with you after everything else is settled. There is documented evidence in conversations that were recorded, in accounts given by people who were present, in the words of men who spent years living inside Elvis's world and have spent the years since living with what they know, that Elvis Presley was aware of what was being taken from him, not in a vague, generalized sense, not in the way that any famous person might dimly sense that their public image has drifted away from who they actually are. Specifically aware. Precisely aware. He knew footage was being pulled. He knew conversations were being managed. He knew that a version of himself was being constructed and sold that he didn't recognize and couldn't control. He knew there were people around him whose job, functionally speaking, was to package him rather than protect him. And he said so. Not publicly. Not in ways that could be used against the machine while the machine was still running at full power, because he understood better than most people what the machine was capable of when it felt threatened. But privately, clearly, repeatedly, with the particular exhausted precision of someone who has been fighting a battle long enough to know they're probably not going to win it, but feels compelled to keep naming what's happening anyway. There is something devastating about that. About a man who had spent his entire adult life being one of the most famous human beings on the planet, and who could not, within the systems that surrounded him, find a way to simply be honestly seen. He tried. In the ways that were available to him within a structure that had been specifically designed to limit his options, that had been built up around him over decades until it was less a support system than an enclosure, he tried. He pushed back where he could. He said things he wasn't supposed to say to people he trusted, and some of those people remembered. And the machine held. Elvis Presley died at 42 years old. 42. An age that feels almost incomprehensibly young when you consider the scale of what he had already lived through, already survived, already built and lost and rebuilt, and had taken from him. And for decades after his death, the people who controlled his image kept right on making decisions about what you were allowed to know about him, about who he was when the cameras weren't pointed at him, about what he thought and felt and feared and said in rooms where the official record wasn't being kept. The footage that's emerging now, piece by piece, year by year, through the slow pressure of time and the loosening grip of certain agreements and the courage of certain individuals who decided the truth mattered more than their continued access, isn't just changing the historical record. It's not just adding footnotes to an established story. It is fundamentally altering the shape of the story itself. And more than that, it is giving back something that was taken. Not from us, from him. That distinction matters. We lost access to the truth about Elvis Presley, and that loss is real. But he lost something larger. The basic human dignity of being known honestly, of having his own experience of his own life acknowledged and preserved and treated as something worth protecting. They took that from him while he was alive, and they kept taking it long after he was gone. That's the part of this story that I don't think we're done processing yet. Not even close. Not as a culture, not as the community of people who care about who Elvis really was, and not as individuals sitting with the quiet discomfort of realizing that the version of the story we were given was never really the whole one. If this story hit different, if it changed something about how you see Elvis, or about how you see the systems that shape What we're allowed to know about the people we think we know? I want to hear it. Drop your reaction in the comments right now. Subscribe, because this is just the beginning of what's still coming out. And what's still coming out is going to matter. And share this with someone who thinks they already know everything about Elvis Presley. They don't. None of us did.